Nowadays, I'm not a giant fan of multiplayer games, especially multiplayer shooters. There are a few multiplayer exceptions, things like Path of Exile, Monster Hunter, and I do want to go back and play some more FF14 and play the latest expansion. I just haven't gotten around to it. So I wasn't affected by the recent Apex Legends change on Linux, but I totally understand why a lot of people are annoyed. This post came basically out of nowhere. Dev team update, Linux and anti-cheat. It is also replicated over on the EA FAQ. We are sharing today that Linux and Steam Deck using Linux will no longer be able to access Apex Legends. Now, whilst this does feel like it came out of nowhere, it does follow some earlier discussion regarding cheaters and anti-cheat and all this fun stuff. So back in August, there was this post, Apex Legends anti-cheat. Basically, they have banned 6 million accounts since launch. That doesn't indicate whether they are just cheaters or they are cheaters and also people breaking other TOS stuff and all that. More than 100,000 accounts are banned each month on average. Over the June-July period, 194,000 of those were cheating, 16,000 were bot accounts. I am not sure how many additional ones were just general TOS breaking, because I guarantee that number isn't 0, so I feel like there are additional bans that are not being included here. Like, you know, I don't know, you're saying racial slurs in chat or something. Now, they do say that additional bans can include prohibited behavior, but it's unclear exactly how many additional bans are in that category. But the main point being, and the point of this video, is there is a lot of people in Apex Legends that are at least attempting to cheat. It's unclear how many of these people are actually successful in cheating, and how many of them attempt to cheat and then get automatically flagged and then dealt with before actually playing a match using the cheated software. So I think everybody can agree it's probably a good thing for the game and its health long term to do something about this problem. Now, what you do about the problem, well, there can be some debate about that. In our efforts to combat cheating in Apex, we've identified Linux OS, which I don't think anybody's ever said to refer to Linux before, but sure, we'll move past that, as being a path for a variety of impactful exploits and cheats. As a result, we've decided to block Linux OS access to the game. While this will impact a small number of Apex players, we believe the decision will meaningfully reduce instances of cheating in our game. Linux is used by default on the Steam Deck. There is currently no reliable way for us to differentiate between a legitimate Steam Deck from a malicious cheat claiming to be a Steam Deck via Linux. This is a completely ridiculous statement because there is no such thing as a legitimate Steam Deck. A Steam Deck is a computer running an operating system that Valve made. You can cheat on SteamOS just as much as you can cheat on any other Linux distro. It's just a Linux distro. So the claim we have here is that whilst Linux is a small percentage of the overall users, a high percentage of the Linux users are cheaters in the game, and the majority of the cheaters come from Linux. I'm not saying this, that is what they are saying. This is a similar claim you'll hear from basically any community that has support for the Linux platform. I remember hearing about it for things like TF2, I've heard about it for CSGO, I've heard about it for this game, and plenty of others. Usually when there are cheaters involved in the game and there's support on Linux, Linux gets most of the blame. Now, I know Linux users want to immediately disregard this and say, no, that's definitely not the case, but the claim isn't entirely without merit. However, it does leave out some very important context. So I decided to do the thing that nobody ever does. Go to a hacking forum, go to a cheating forum, and see what the actual cheaters have to say about this. Now, there's a very important caveat with EAC on Linux that often isn't discussed. EAC on Linux isn't a kernel-level anti-cheat. Now, EAC is. On Linux, it runs in user mode. And It is so easy to bypass that cheat developers on Linux don't even talk about needing to bypass EAC. It is that easy to work around. Also, because it is so easy to work around, a lot of the cheats for games like Apex are not only free, but are also FOSS. Like, you see people going around forking cheats and just making new versions based off of other versions. This is not something you see on Windows because there is a lot of money to be made having a cheat that breaks EAC. So if you're someone who wants to cheat in a game, getting your hands on cheats on Linux is, at least for any semi-popular game, really, really easy. It doesn't mean you won't get banned, and it doesn't mean that you should do it, but it's relatively easy. At the same time, most of the players in a game, any game, pick a game, Apex Legends, anything else, most of the players are on Windows. And whilst gamers do generally have some sort of like knowledge that Linux does exist, most people don't want to go out of their way to learn Linux, to install Linux, to switch to Linux. So even though it is so easy, and people that basically want to do nothing but cheat are going to go over to it, most of the cheaters are still on Windows. It's estimated somewhere around like 90 to 95% are still using Windows. So it is true to say that amongst the Linux audience, there is a higher percentage of cheaters. However, even though the percentage is higher than on Windows, the overall number is a fraction of what you have from the Windows side. What we are doing here is basically looking at the problem of cheaters and saying, okay, how do we fix the problem? And you see this tiny little leak that you can just like cover up with a band-aid, and you slap a band-aid on it, and then right next to it, there is a giant gaping cannon hole, and we're just not going to talk about that. What a lot of the cheaters think is this is going to have basically zero effect on the overall number of cheaters. Maybe it'll cut back by a couple of percent, but the people who really want to cheat are going to go back to Windows, they're going to start paying for cheats, and they're gonna keep cheating. So to me, when they say the openness of the Linux operating system makes it an attractive one for cheaters and cheat developers, Linux cheats are indeed harder to detect, and the data shows they are growing at a rate that requires an outsized level of focus and attention from the team for a relatively small platform. There are also cases in which cheats for Windows OS get emulated as if it's on Linux in order to increase the difficulty of detection and prevention. They're not entirely wrong here, but they're also intentionally missing a lot of the context on what the actual problem is. We had to weigh the decision on the number of players who were legitimately playing on Linux/Steam Deck versus the greater health of the population of players for Apex. While the population of Linux users is small, their impact affected a fair amount of players' games. This ultimately brought us to our decision today. Again, it is a band-aid fix for a giant stab wound, and they are bleeding out and have no idea how to fix it. To eliminate this cheat vector, we have made the decision to prevent access to the game for Linux players. This means that Apex Legends will be unplayable immediately for those running this operating system. Playing on handhelds such as the Steam Deck is still possible if the user opts to install Windows, which there are people that do this, and of course there are the other handhelds like the ROG Ally and things like that, but you know, you bought a Steam Deck, it's got Linux on it, most people again are just not going to deal with that, and they just run the OS on the device. Now, the response to this has been fairly mixed, kind of depending on whether you actually buy what they're saying in the post. W update, this will cut back on cheaters. I've been playing Apex and Linux since the start. How dare you block me? I'm gonna, I don't know, do whatever you could possibly do. Leave a negative Steam review, I guess. Actually, a lot of people have been doing that, and, well, to be fair, a lot of the negative reviews are from the Linux users. A lot of the other negative reviews are people angry about the general state of the game. So it's sort of this, like, typhoon of negativity. Now, for a lot of developers, it's fairly easy to describe their stance on Linux. If you're a Epic, you don't like them. You don't want to support Linux. You actively hate Linux. You will actively block Linux. For other developers, it's kind of just apathy. You know, it's there. You don't do anything to help it. You don't do anything to stop it. It kind of just exists, and you don't really have any reason to stop them. This is kind of the Path of Exile approach and other things like that. Respawn, the developers of Apex, is a little bit weird because they did previously actually care about Linux. The game was Steam Deck verified. Then after some updates, it dropped down to Steam Deck playable, and now because of the whole anti-cheat not working on Linux, it's unsupported. Now, unless you're like really, really lucky and you design your game from the ground up to be playable on a handheld device, especially a device like the Steam Deck, you don't accidentally make a Steam Deck verified game. Like, you need to go and actively do that, actively make changes, provide a profile for the game that makes it run well on a Steam Deck, and they had gone and done all of that stuff. But it was never the public official stance that they really like Linux, that they're going to support Linux, they're going to make sure that Linux is always good. There was an update quite a while back that I guess someone forgot to push out the EAC stuff and it broke that version, and when that happened, they did go and add that issue over to their Trello board for Apex Legends. So clearly somebody on the team, at least one person, cared enough about making sure Linux was supported. Now it's time to get that tinfoil hat ready, put it on your head, because now we're in for conspiracy time. So I've heard some interesting theories about why they're dropping EAC on Linux. The cheater idea is sort of just a convenient justification. Apex Legends is an EA game, and some EA titles, like Battlefield, a lot of their sports titles, have been moving over to another anti-cheat called EAAC, EA Anti-Cheat. This doesn't have support for Linux whatsoever, and I don't think they're ever gonna add it. It is what it is. My prediction is Apex Legends, at some point in the nearish future, is also going to move off of EAC over to EAAC. Now, when this happened with Battlefield, there were a lot of Linux players who were really annoyed by this because suddenly the game they were playing is just broken. Doesn't work, they can't play it any longer. But if they drop the Linux players during EAC, and then they move to EAAC, the Linux players, sure, they're going to be annoyed because now the game's never going to work on Linux. But they were already annoyed before. They'd already given up on the game. So they're not going to be anywhere near as annoyed when the game moves over to another anti-cheat system that doesn't support Linux. For the record, I have absolutely no insider knowledge. This could just be complete nonsense. However, with how many EA titles are moving over to EAAC, and not just new titles, old titles that were using other anti-cheat systems, I don't think it's impossible, and if anything, I think it's fairly likely. Now, of course, there are people debating, okay, well, what can we do as players? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again in the future? And this is one of the popular threads. EU Linux player, possible legal action after remove compatibility. Now, the person here admits they're not a lawyer. I am not a lawyer either. And I do support movements like stop killing games. However, I do think that something like this would have a very serious backlash and wouldn't result in what people would expect. If game developers thought that Linux players would sue them if maybe they drop support for Linux, what you're going to see happen is, from the very start of the game being released, it's going to block Linux. They're just not going to take the risk of dropping Linux support sometime down the line and just not even deal with the problem. I get people just wanting to do something, but this I just don't think is a good approach to it. However, when it comes to things like Steam reviews, as I mentioned, feel free to go ahead and leave negative reviews. Not all of these are from Linux players. They're just generally not happy with the game. I have no issue with people leaving a review on a game that is negative. I know people talk about, oh, review bombing. I don't care. If you're not happy with the state of a game, you're allowed to be negative about the game. Now, I decided to run a poll on my channel just to see how many people actually care about Apex Legends, and it seems like not a ton, but, you know, some people actually do. And maybe it's caring about it not because of Apex itself, but the general idea of game support being removed on Linux. Hopefully, this gets resolved. I really don't expect it to. I really do think the EAAC thing is actually going to happen. Hopefully, more games don't follow down this route, and I don't know, like, I just can't find myself wanting to get into, like, a competitive multiplayer game at this point. If I'm going to play multiplayer, I just want to do something cooperative, or better yet, something I can play entirely solo and only bring in other players when I actually get something to benefit from. But what are your thoughts? Let me know down below. If you play video games, are you someone who plays single-player games only, multiplayer games, massive multiplayer games, competitive games, or a mix of all? I would love to know. Let me know your favorite game down below. And if you liked the video, go like the video. If you really want to like the video, yeah, that's how I say it. I want to become one of these amazing people over here. Check out Patreon, Scribes, Daily Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and at least it's not as cooked as the Monster Hunter Wilds beta.
Like this.